the letter, and ran off into the night. Chapter 11. The Letter. Jean Valjean, at that moment, was in a state of terrible shock. For the first time in their life together, he and Cosette had quarrelled. She had not wanted to leave the house, but she had eventually obeyed him. They had left quickly at nightfall, bringing their servant, Toussaint, with them, but very little luggage. Cosette had brought her letter-case and blotter with her, Valjean his box of child's clothing, and the old National Guard uniform which all respectable men possessed, and which he had worn under a previous identity. In their new house they went to bed in silence. Cosette, however, did not leave her bedroom the next day, and Jean Valjean had dinner alone. As he was eating, Toussaint told him about the fighting in the city, but he did not pay much attention. He was too worried about Cosette. There was no reason, he thought, why they should not continue to live happily together in England. As long as he had Cosette, he would be happy, and it did not matter where they lived. He began to feel happier as he thought about the journey they would soon be making. He stood up and was going to leave the room, when something made him stop. He glanced again at the mirror. Cosette's blotter was lying on a cupboard just below it, and, as Valjean stared at its reflection, he read the following lines. My dearest, we are leaving this house at once. We go tonight to number 7, Rue de l'Homme Armé, and in a week we shall be in England. Cosette, the 4th of June. In her unhappy state of mind, Cosette had forgotten to remove the page that she had used to blot the letter she had written to Marius. She had left it on the cupboard, and the mirror, reflecting the backwards handwriting, made the message clearly visible. Valjean moved closer to the mirror and read the lines again, not wanting to believe them. But there was no doubt that this was Cosette's handwriting. He began to shake, and he fell back into an armchair, feeling angry and betrayed. He had suffered terribly over the years, and until now he had survived every disaster. But this was the worst thing that had ever happened to him. Someone was threatening to rob him of the only person he loved. He murmured to himself, "She's going to leave me." And the pain of those words cut into his heart like a knife. After a short time he rose to his feet and looked again at the blotter. His anger and misery of minutes before had been replaced by a terrible calmness. He stared at the blotter, coldness in his eyes, the darkness of the deepest night in his heart. He remembered clearly the young man in the Luxembourg Gardens who had shown such great interest in Cosette, and he was certain that this was the man she had written to. He went out into the night and sat on the doorstep, his heart filled with a terrible hatred for the man who was trying to steal Cosette from him. He sat for a long time, listening to the sound of distant gunfire in the city, wondering how to get his revenge, when suddenly he heard footsteps. Looking up, he saw a pale-faced boy, dressed in rags, studying the numbers of the houses in the street. Seeing Valjean on his doorstep, the boy stopped and asked, "Do you live in this street?" "Yes. Why?" "I'm looking for number 7. I have a letter for a girl who lives here." "Well, I'm the girl's father. You can give the letter to me. Oh, and one more thing before you go. Valjean said when the boy had handed him the letter. "Where should I take the reply?" "That letter comes from the barricade in the Rue de la Chambrerie," the boy replied, "which is where I'm going now. Good night, citizen." Jean Valjean went back into the house and tried to make sense of the words that danced before his eyes. "I shall die. When you read this, my soul will be very near." This was enough to fill his hate-filled heart with sudden joy. So the problem was solved. The man who threatened his happiness was going to die, was perhaps already dead. Then Valjean frowned, and after a quick calculation, decided that Marius was probably still alive. But it made no difference. He was still certain to die, and Valjean's happiness would be safe. If he kept the letter in his pocket, Cosette would never know what had happened to the other man, and life with her would continue the same as before. What happiness! But his happiness had no sooner returned than it disappeared again in a cloud of despair. In his heart he knew he had no choice. For the sake of Cosette's happiness, he would have to try and save the life of the man she loved, the man he hated more than any other in the world. Half an hour later, he left the house, dressed in his National Guard uniform, with a loaded gun and a pocket full of gunpowder, and made his way towards the market district of Paris. Chapter 12. Fight to the Death. During the night, the 37 remaining rebels strengthened the main barricade and made more bullets. The ground floor of the wine shop became a hospital for the wounded, and the bodies of the dead were taken to an alley near the smaller of the two barricades. 4 of the dead people were National Guards, and their uniforms were removed. After a long discussion with his friends, Enjolras decided that the married men, there were 5 of them, had to leave. "It's your duty not to die," he told them. "You must return to your families." "How can we leave?" they protested. "We're surrounded. The soldiers will shoot us as soon as they see us." "You can wear these." Enjolras pointed to the National Guard uniforms that had been taken off the dead soldiers. "But there are only 4, Marius observed. "Then one of us must stay and fight," one of the married men replied. A long argument followed, during which each of the married men tried to persuade the others to go. Finally, someone shouted to Marius, "You decide which one must stay." Marius went pale at the thought of having to choose which man had to die. He stared down at the 4 uniforms, but as he did so, a 5th uniform fell as if by magic at his feet. Looking round, Marius recognized Cosette's father. Jean Valjean, who had arrived unnoticed at the barricade, had been listening to the argument and had quickly understood the situation. "Now you can all leave," he said. The sky grew lighter, but not a door or window was open in the street. The barricade was stronger than it had been for the first assault, and the rebels were at their positions, guns loaded and ready for action. They did not have long to wait. Sounds of chains and of heavy wheels moving along the stone streets could be heard, and then soldiers came into view at the end of the street, pulling a large cannon. The rebels fired their guns, but when the smoke had cleared, they saw the soldiers unharmed, steadily aiming the cannon at the barricade. Moments later, An officer shouted a command, and the cannon roared into action. The cannonball crashed into the bottom of the barricade with a loud explosion, but did little damage. The rebels clapped and cheered. More soldiers moved into position at the end of the street, behind the cannon, and started to build a low wall with pieces of broken stone. At the same time, the leader of the gun crew adjusted the aim of the cannon. "Heads down!" Enjolras shouted. The next cannonball exploded against the wall at one end of the barricade, killing 2 men and wounding 3. "We mustn't let that happen again," Enjolras said. He aimed his gun over the barricade at the leader of the gun crew and fired. The gunner, a fair-haired, handsome young man, spun round twice with his head thrown back and fell sideways across the cannon. Blood poured from the middle of his back. A tear rolled down Enjolras' cheek. "It's sad," he murmured to Marius, who was standing next to him. "He looked a brave young man." The battle continued for some time. The cannon destroyed the upper windows of the wine shop and did some damage to the barricade, but the rebels did not withdraw. They fired back at the soldiers, killing many men. In the pauses between shooting, the rebels could hear the sound of fighting in other parts of Paris. They were filled with hope that help would come soon, but the hope did not last long. Within half an hour, the sound of gunfire in other places had stopped, and the rebels knew that they were alone. When a second cannon was moved into position next to the first, they knew that the end was near. Both cannons fired together, accompanied by gunfire from soldiers at the end of the street and on the rooftops. As other guns began firing at the smaller barricade, the rebels fought back bravely, but they were running out of bullets. There were only 26 men left, and the main attack on the barricade was going to take place very soon. Some men, including Marius, stayed on the main barricade, while the others built a low stone wall around the door of the wine shop. Enjolras, inside the wine shop, turned to Javert, who was still tied to the post. "I haven't forgotten you," he said, putting a loaded gun on the table. "The last man to leave this place will blow your brains out." At this point, Jean Valjean spoke to Enjolras. "You're the leader, aren't you? Can I ask you for a favor?" "You saved a man's life by giving him your uniform. You deserve some reward. What do you want?" "Let me kill this man." "That's fair," Enjolras decided, when nobody objected. "You can have your spy." At the same moment, there was the sound of a drum, followed by a loud roar. "They're coming!" cried Marius from the top of the barricade. The rebels rushed to their positions, leaving Valjean alone with Javert inside the wine shop. Valjean untied the rope around Javert's feet, and taking him by the belt of his coat, led him outside. Only Marius, looking over his shoulder, saw them cross the stronghold towards the smaller barricade. Valjean, his gun in one hand, pulled Javert behind him over the barricade and into a narrow alley where the corner of a house hid them from view. A terrible heap of dead bodies lay not far away, among them the blood-stained body of a young girl in man's clothes, Éponine. Javert glanced at the dead body and murmured, "I think I know that girl." Then, returning his attention to Valjean, he said calmly, "I think you know me, too. Take your revenge." Valjean, however, took a knife from his pocket and cut the ropes that tied Javert's wrists. "You're free to go," he said. When Javert stared at him, speechless with surprise, Valjean went on, "I don't suppose I'll leave here alive, but if I do, I'm staying at number 7, Rue de l'Homme Armé. Now go." Javert buttoned his coat, straightened his shoulders, and, with a puzzled look on his face, began to walk off in the direction of the market. He had only gone a few steps, however, when he turned and looked at Valjean. "I find this embarrassing," he said. "I'd rather you killed me." "Go away," Valjean replied. Javert walked away slowly, and Valjean, waiting for him to turn a corner, fired his gun into the air and returned to the stronghold. "It's done," he said. There was a roar of gunfire, and the soldiers attacked, rushing towards the barricade. Many fell, but many more reached the barricade. The first assault was beaten back by the brave rebels, but the soldiers attacked again and again. Soon the ground below the barricade was piled with dead and wounded men as the rebels and soldiers fought hand to hand. The rebels fought long and hard to defend the stronghold, but finally they had to withdraw to the low wall outside the wine shop. They stood with their backs to the door, shooting up at the soldiers who were climbing down towards them from the barricade. One by one, the remaining rebels escaped into the wine shop, until only Enjolras and Marius were left outside. As the two friends moved back towards the door, fighting off the soldiers, a bullet hit Marius in the shoulder. His eyes closed, and in great pain, he felt a hand grab him as he fell. "They've taken me prisoner," he thought, moments before losing consciousness. "Now I shall be shot." The soldiers, meanwhile, attacked the wine shop. Before long they broke down the door and rushed inside. Enjolras and the few surviving rebels fought bravely, but the soldiers were too strong. Soon all the rebels were dead, including Enjolras, who was the last to die. Sword in hand, surrounded by soldiers, he refused to surrender. He died in a rain of bullets, with a strangely victorious smile on his lips. Chapter 13. The Sewers of Paris. Marius had indeed been taken prisoner, but not by the soldiers. It was Jean Valjean's hand that had caught him as he fell. Valjean had taken no part in the battle. He had been looking after wounded men while bullets flew all around him. When Marius had been hit, Valjean ran to him at once, grabbed him before he fell, and carried his unconscious body into a small alley behind the wine shop. Valjean lowered Marius to the ground, stood with his back to the wall, and looked around him. The situation was terrible. There seemed to be no escape. On one side of him was the field of battle. On the other side was the low barricade, behind which hundreds of soldiers waited for rebels trying to escape. Both ways meant certain death. It was a situation that only a bird could have escaped from. Valjean looked desperately around him, at the house opposite, the barricade, the ground. And then he had a sudden idea. At the foot of the smaller barricade, half hidden by broken stones and pieces of wood, there was a hole in the road, covered with an iron grill. Valjean leapt forward, and using all his strength, he moved the stones and wood, opened the grill, lifted Marius onto his shoulders, and climbed down into the darkness. A few minutes later, he found himself in a long underground passage, a place of absolute peace and silence. He was inside the Paris sewers. He could just see, by the grey light from the grille above his head, that he was surrounded by walls. Ahead of him lay total darkness. But he had to go on. The soldiers might discover the grille by the barricade at any moment, and come down in search of him. With Marius lying across his shoulders, Valjean walked forward into the darkness, feeling his way along the wet, slippery walls with his hands. He moved from one passage into another, slipping several times on the wet floor. He could not see where he was going, but he knew he had to follow the downward slope of the passages towards the river. He walked blindly downwards in this way for a long time, his clothes wet with the blood from Marius's wound, the faint whisper of the young man's breath in his ear. He walked in total darkness, the silence broken occasionally by the thunder of gun carriages and horses racing along the streets of Paris far above his head. Suddenly, he saw his own shadow on the floor of the passage in front of him. Looking back, he saw the distant light of a torch. He was being followed. He pressed himself against the wall, held his breath, and waited. In the distance, a group of men formed a circle around the torchlight. They seemed to be listening for something, waiting for someone to move. Finally, the group of men moved off along another passage, and Valjean was left in total darkness once again. He continued his journey through the sewers. Sometimes the roof of the passages was so low that he had to bend down as he walked. His feet slipped all the time in the water on the ground, and he felt sick and faint with the terrible airless smell. At last, exhausted, he stopped beneath a large grille that brought him much-needed light and fresh air. He laid Marius down gently at the edge of the sewer, and looked down at his face. It was covered with blood and as pale as death. Valjean tore pieces off his own shirt and bandaged Marius's wounded shoulder as well as he could. Then, bending over the unconscious body, Valjean stared at Marius with hatred in his eyes. He found two objects in Marius's clothing, a piece of bread and a wallet. Valjean ate the bread, and opening the wallet, found a note which Marius had written. "My name is Marius Pontmercy. My body must be taken to the house of my grandfather, Monsieur Gillenormand, 6 Rue des Filles du Calvaire, in the Marais." Valjean repeated the address until he could remember it, returned the wallet to Marius's pocket, picked Marius up again, and continued his journey downwards towards the river. He did not know what part of the city he was passing under, or how far he had come. The only thing he was sure of was that the light through the grilles far above his head was growing weaker, which meant that the sun was setting. At one point, he had to walk waist-deep through water, and almost sank as the ground turned to sand beneath his feet. Finally, when even his great strength was beginning to fade, he saw ahead of him a light, the clear light of day. He was suddenly filled with new energy at the sight, at last, of his way of escape from the sewers. Forgetting the weight of Marius on his shoulders and his own hunger and tiredness, he ran towards the light. He had to bend as the roof of the tunnel became lower. But when he reached the light, Valjean stopped and gave a cry of despair. The opening was closed with a strong iron gate, held firm by a huge rusty lock. Through the bars, Valjean could see daylight, the river, a narrow river bank. But how could he get out? Valjean laid Marius down by the wall, where the floor was dry. Then, moving to the gate, he shook it fiercely with both hands, trying to bend the bars with the last of his strength. But the gate was solid, and the bars were firm. Valjean turned his back to the gate and sank to the ground, his head bowed between his knees. There was no way out. And as all hope of escape left him, he began to think of Cosette. While in this state of despair, Valjean felt a hand on his shoulder. He thought he was dreaming. He looked up and saw a man dressed in old clothes standing beside him. Despite the unexpectedness of this meeting, Valjean recognized the man at once. It was Thénardier. Valjean did not show that he recognized the man, and saw with relief that Thénardier had not recognized him.
"I'll make a bargain with you," the man said.
"What do you mean?" Thénardier nodded in Marius's direction.
"You've killed a man. Give me half of what you found in this man's pockets, and I'll unlock the gate for you."
He produced a large key from his pocket and a piece of rope.
"I'll give you this as well," he said. "Then you can tie stones to the body and throw it in the river."
Valjean took the rope without speaking.
"What about my share of the money?" Thénardier asked.
Valjean took 30 francs from his pockets and showed it to Thénardier, who stared with disbelief.
"You killed a man for just 30 francs? You're a fool."
He searched Marius's pockets himself, and then Valjean's.
"It's true," he said at last. "That's all there is. Oh, well, never say that I'm not a kind man."
He took the 30 francs, and helping Valjean to lift Marius onto his shoulders, he put the key in the lock and opened the gate just wide enough for Valjean to pass through. When Valjean was outside, Thénardier closed the gate behind him and disappeared like a rat into the darkness of the sewers. Valjean laid Marius gently on the grass and stood up, surrounded by silence, enjoying the feeling of fresh air on his face. Then, just as he was bending to splash water from the river on Marius's face, he was aware of someone else standing behind him. He looked round quickly and saw a tall man in a long coat, a large stick in his hand. Although the man's face was hidden in shadow, Valjean recognized him as Inspector Javert. Javert, however, did not recognize Valjean at first. He had been more interested in catching Thénardier, who had escaped from prison and was known to be in the area.
"Who are you?"
he asked. Valjean told him his name and stood without moving as Javert approached and stared into his eyes.
"Inspector Javert,"
Valjean said quietly,
"I beg you to do me one favor. I promise not to try and escape. I gave you my address this morning, if you remember, so you would know where to find me anyway."
Javert did not seem to hear. He stared into Valjean's eyes for a long time, then, stepping back with a look of confusion in his eyes, asked dreamily,
"What are you doing here? Who is this man?"
"Will you help me to take him home?" Valjean said. "He's badly injured." Javert looked unhappy, but he did not refuse. Bending down, he took a handkerchief from his pocket, wet it in the river, and bathed Marius's blood-stained forehead. Then he felt Marius's wrist.
"He's dead,"
he said. "No, not yet," Valjean replied, feeling in Marius's jacket for the wallet. "Look," he said, showing Javert the note with Marius's grandfather's address. "That's where we need to take him." Javert shouted to the driver, who was waiting for him to bring his carriage close to the river. With Marius in the back seat, Valjean and Javert side by side in the front, the carriage drove off quickly through the dark and strangely empty streets of Paris. When they arrived at Monsieur Gillenormand's house, a servant answered the door.
"Does Monsieur Gillenormand live here?"
Javert asked.
"Yes. What do you want?" "We're bringing back his grandson. He's dead. Go and wake his grandfather. We're bringing him in."
Javert, Valjean, and the driver carried Marius into the house and laid him gently on a sofa in Monsieur Gillenormand's sitting-room. While one servant ran to find a doctor and another looked for clean sheets, Valjean felt Javert's hand on his arm. He understood, and went downstairs with Javert close behind him. When they had got back into the carriage, however, Valjean said, "Inspector, will you do one last thing for me before you arrest me?"
"What is it?"
Javert replied impatiently. "Let me go home for a minute. After that, you can do whatever you want with me." Javert was silent for some moments, his chin sunk in the collar of his overcoat. Then he pulled down the window in front of him.
"Number 7, Rue de l'Homme Armé," he told the driver.
Neither man spoke during the journey. At the end of the Rue de l'Homme Armé, which was too narrow for the carriage to enter, Javert paid the driver and accompanied Valjean to his front door on foot.
"Go in,"
said Javert with a strange, distant look in his eyes.
"I'll wait for you here."
Valjean went into his house and called, "It's me!" Climbing the stairs, he paused for a moment to look out of the window to see what Javert was doing. But the street was empty. There was no one there. The next morning, Inspector Javert's body was discovered floating in the river. The poor man, unable to understand the kindness and gentle nature of the man he had spent his whole life hating, had taken his own life by jumping from a bridge. It was the only way he knew to escape the confusion that was poisoning his heart. When Monsieur Gillenormand saw his pale, lifeless-looking grandson lying on the sofa, he shook from head to foot. Leaning against the door for support, he murmured, "Marius!" "He's just been brought here," said a servant. "He was on the barricade, and—" "He's dead!" cried the old man in a terrible voice. "The fool! He did this to hurt me, the ungrateful boy. I try to be good to him, and this is how he rewards me." The old man walked to the window, and while he complained to the night about the pain and grief his grandson had caused him, the doctor arrived. After listening to Marius's heart, he organized his removal to a bed in another room, and returned to Monsieur Gillenormand, who was still standing by the window.
Will he live? Monsieur Gillenormand asked, his eyes wild with fear. I don't know, the doctor replied. The wound to his body is not serious, but there are deep cuts on his head. It's difficult to say. Monsieur Gillenormand went to Marius's bedside. You heartless boy, he said angrily. A fool who prefers fighting to dancing and having fun. What kind of man are you? Are you mad? But it makes no difference. I too shall die. That makes you a murderer, a cold-hearted killer. I cannot feel grief for you. At that moment, Marius's eyes slowly opened, and his gaze rested upon Monsieur Gillenormand. Marius! The old man cried. Marius! My child! Grandson! You're alive after all! Chapter 14. The Wedding. Marius lay for a long time between life and death in a state of fever, endlessly repeating the name of Cosette. He mustn't get excited, the doctor warned. Every day, according to one of the servants, a white-haired, well-dressed gentleman came to ask for news of the sick man. Finally, after 3 months, the doctor announced that Marius was out of danger. But he had to spend the next 2 months resting because of the damage to his shoulder. Monsieur Gillenormand grew happier as his grandson's condition improved. He did strange, unexpected things, like running up and down stairs without knowing why. He gave his neighbour, a pretty woman, a bunch of flowers, which greatly annoyed her husband. Marius, meanwhile, tried to make sense of what had happened to him. He thought about Enjolras and Éponine, and wondered why Cosette's father had been at the barricade. He could not understand why nobody could tell him how he had been saved. All he knew was that he had been brought to his grandfather's house in a carriage. He noticed his grandfather's tenderness towards him, but he could not forget the old man's unfairness and cruelty to his father, who had died penniless and unloved. Most of all, however, he thought about Cosette, and how he could find her again. "There's something I have to say to you," Marius told his grandfather one day. "What is it?" "I want to get married." "But of course!" the old man laughed. "What do you mean, of course?" "That's understood. You will have your little girl." "I don't understand," Marius said, almost speechless with amazement. "You will have her," the old man repeated. "She comes here every day, in the shape of an old man who asks for news of you. While you've been ill, she's spent her time crying and making bandages for you. I know all about her. She lives at number 7, Rue de l'Homme Armé. You see, I'm not as unkind as you think. I've found out that she's a charming girl, and that she loves you. I knew you were angry with me, and I thought, what can I do to make him love me? Then I thought, I can give him Cosette. I wanted to invite her to see you, but the doctor warned me that you would probably get too excited. So I advise you, dear boy, to eat more meat and get better soon. Then you can marry your Cosette and be happy." Having said this, the old man burst into tears. He held Marius's head to his chest, and they cried together. "Grandfather," Marius said at last, I'm feeling much better already. When can I see her?
You can see her tomorrow.
Why not today?
All right, I'll fetch her today. You've called me grandfather. You've shown me that you love me after all. You've earned your reward.
Later that day, Cosette arrived at Monsieur Gillenormand's house. Standing beside her on the doorstep was a white-haired man with a strangely nervous smile. Monsieur Gillenormand showed them up to the room where Marius was waiting. Cosette stood in the doorway, overcome with happiness. She wanted to throw herself into Marius's arms, but was unable to move, afraid to show the world that she loved him.
Monsieur
Gillenormand addressed Jean Valjean.
I have the honor, on behalf of my grandson, Marius Pontmercy, to ask for your daughter's hand in marriage.
Jean Valjean bowed.
Good. Then that is agreed.
Monsieur Gillenormand said, and turning to Marius and Cosette, he added,
My children, you are free to love one another.
When they were alone together, Cosette and Marius kissed.
Is it really you?
Cosette murmured at last.
I can't believe it. I'm so happy to see you. I was so excited today that I haven't even dressed up for you. I must look terrible. But why don't you say something? Why are you letting me do all the talking? Do you still love me? Oh, I'm so wild with happiness.
My love, Marius whispered. The wedding was arranged for February the following year. Jean Valjean arranged everything. Having been a mayor, he knew how to solve an awkward problem, the question of Cosette's real family. He told everybody that he was not her father, but her guardian. He also invented a dead family for Cosette, so that everybody believed she was an orphan. Valjean, as her guardian, gave Cosette a large amount of money, 500,000 francs, but did not tell her that the money was his. He told her that the money came from a man who preferred to remain unknown. It was arranged that the couple, who could not believe their sudden new-found happiness, would live with Monsieur Gillenormand after the wedding. Cosette, accompanied by Jean Valjean, visited Marius every day. Marius did not speak much to Valjean. Despite enjoying an occasional conversation with him, he found something strange about the old man. He could not believe that this was the same man he had seen at the barricade all those months ago. It seemed like a bad dream to him. But there were more important things for Marius to think about. Apart from preparing for his wedding, there were two people that he wanted to find. First, there was Thénardier. He was, without doubt, a bad man. But Marius had promised his father to find him and help him. He employed agents to find Thénardier, but without success. The only thing they discovered was that Madame Thénardier had died, and that her husband had escaped from prison and disappeared with his surviving daughter, Azelma. Second, there was the mysterious stranger who had saved his life. Marius's attempts to find him also ended in failure, and the true story of his escape from the barricade remained a complete mystery to him. One evening, when Marius was talking to Cosette and Jean Valjean about the mystery and his unsuccessful attempts to solve it, he became angry with Cosette's guardian's lack of interest in his story. "The man was a hero," Marius said.
Do you realize, monsieur, how brave this man was? He rescued me from the field of battle and carried me through the sewers of Paris. He risked his life to save a dying man. And why? He was a total stranger. He did it without any thought of a reward. Oh, I wish Cosette's money were mine.
It is yours,
Valjean reminded him. I would give it all, said Marius, to find that man. Jean Valjean was silent. Cosette and Marius made a handsome couple on their wedding day. All previous unhappiness was forgotten as they kissed in the church, watched proudly by Monsieur Gillenormand and Jean Valjean. There were flowers everywhere when they returned to Monsieur Gillenormand's house for the wedding feast. It was the happiest night of Cosette's life, spoilt only by one thing, the fact that her guardian, whom she still thought of as her father, went home before the feast had started, saying that he felt ill. But Cosette was not unhappy for long. She had Marius, and she would be happy with him for the rest of her life. Jean Valjean, meanwhile, went home, lit his candle, and went upstairs to bed. That night, however, he was unable to sleep. He remembered the little girl he had rescued from the Thénardiers 10 years earlier, and felt sad that he was no longer the most important man in her life. Another man was the center of her universe. He was proud of having helped to bring her happiness with Marius, but another thing troubled his soul. The fact that nobody, not even Cosette, knew the truth about him. That he was Jean Valjean, a criminal who had spent 19 years in prison and who had stolen silver candlesticks from a trusting and kind-hearted bishop. He knew that if he told Cosette and Marius the truth, he would spoil everybody's happiness, and he would lose their love and respect. On the other hand, if he continued to lie about his past, he would lose his own soul. What could he do? The next day Valjean visited Monsieur Gillenormand's house, and asked to speak to Marius in private. Marius hugged Valjean warmly, addressed him as father, and invited him to lunch. But Valjean shook his head and said, "Monsieur, I have something to tell you." Marius listened quietly as Valjean told him everything about his life. Finally, in a state of shock and confusion, the young man said, "Why have you told me all this? No one forced you to."
"If I had continued to keep my secret to myself, I would have destroyed my own heart," Valjean replied. "Besides, I belong to no family. Cosette was the only family I ever had. Everything ended for me when she married you yesterday. She is happy with the man she loves. I tried to persuade myself that it would be better not to admit the truth about my past, but it was no use. I could not silence the voice that speaks to me when I am alone." Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Then Marius murmured, "Poor Cosette. When she hears—" "But you must promise not to tell her," Valjean interrupted. "She'll be heartbroken if she hears the truth about me. I don't think I could bear it." He sank into an armchair and buried his face in his hands. "Don't worry," Marius said at last. "I'll keep your secret. But I think it would be better if you stopped seeing her." "I understand," Valjean said, rising to leave. But at the door he half turned and said, "Monsieur, if you will permit me, I would like to come and see her. I wouldn't come often or stay very long. We could meet in that little room on the ground floor. Please, monsieur, if I can't see Cosette again, I'll have nothing left to live for. Besides, if I suddenly stopped visiting, people would become suspicious and begin to talk.
You can come every evening, said Marius.
Monsieur, you're very kind, said Jean Valjean,
shaking Marius's hand and leaving the room. Chapter 15. The Truth at Last. Marius kept his promise about not telling Cosette, and Valjean visited her every evening in a small room on the ground floor. It was cold and damp, but a fire had been lit, and 2 armchairs had been placed in front of it. At first, Cosette could not understand why Valjean refused to meet her upstairs. When he refused to kiss her cheek, she began to feel unhappy, afraid that she had done something to offend him. She pressed his hands in hers and held them to her lips. "Please, please be kind," she begged. "I want you to come and live with us. You'll always be my father, and I'm not going to let you go." He released his hands.
You mustn't call me father any more, he told her. You must call me Monsieur Jean.
"I don't understand," she said, becoming angry. "This is ridiculous. You're upsetting me very much, and I don't know why you're being so cruel."
You don't need a father any more. You have a husband.
"What a thing to say," Cosette replied. "Are you angry with me because I'm happy?"
"Cosette," he said, "your happiness is the only thing that matters to me. You're happy now, and so my work is complete."
With these words, he picked up his hat and left. Jean Valjean continued his evening visits, but the relationship between himself and Cosette became cooler and more distant. She stopped calling him father or asking him questions. As Monsieur Jean, he gradually became a different person to her, and she began not to depend on him for her happiness. Valjean would sit looking at Cosette in silence, or would talk about incidents from their past. One evening in April, he called at the usual time, but was told that Cosette had gone out with her husband. He waited in the small, damp room for an hour before sadly returning home. Over the next few days, his visits began to be interrupted by servants calling Cosette to dinner. When he arrived, he discovered that the fire had not been lit, and the armchairs had been left near the door. One evening, he discovered there were no chairs in the room at all. He and Cosette had to stand in the cold for their whole meeting. Valjean realized what was happening. Marius was telling the servants not to make him welcome any more. That night he went home in despair, and the next evening he did not come at all. When Valjean did not appear for the second evening, Cosette sent a servant to his house to ask if he was well. Valjean replied that he was very well, but that he had business to attend to. He did not return to the house again, and Cosette was too busy with married life to think too much about him. She did not realize that every evening Valjean would walk slowly from his house until he reached the corner of the street where she lived. He would then stare at the house for several minutes, tears rolling down his cheeks, before turning round and slowly returning home. Marius thought it was right to exclude Valjean from Cosette's life.
He achieved this without cruelty, but without weakness. Apart from the details about his life that Valjean had confessed to him, he knew that Valjean had killed Inspector Javert at the barricade. His private investigations into the old man's past had also revealed an even more disgusting fact. He had discovered that Valjean's money really belonged to somebody called Monsieur Madeleine, a wealthy manufacturer from Montreuil who had mysteriously disappeared. He persuaded Cosette, therefore, not to use any of the money her guardian had given her, and to live on the money that he had started to earn as a lawyer. Cosette had not been happy about this. She could not understand why her father, as she still thought of Valjean, had stopped visiting her. She still loved him in her heart, but she loved her husband even more, and she gradually became used to not depending on the old man for her happiness. One evening a servant brought Marius a letter saying, "The writer is waiting in the hall." The smell of tobacco and the handwriting on the envelope was so familiar that Marius immediately thought of the Jondrettes. He read the letter quickly. It was signed Thénard, and was asking for money. Marius could not believe his luck. He had tried without success to find the man who had saved his father's life at Waterloo, and now the man had come to him. He immediately asked the servant to show the man in. However, Marius had a shock when he saw the man. He did not recognize him at all. He was an old man, with a big nose, glasses, and neat grey hair. He was wearing smart black clothes, and a gold watch chain hung from his jacket pocket. "What do you want?" Marius asked coldly as the stranger bowed to him. The stranger explained in great detail how he used to work for the government in foreign countries, and that now he was retired, he wanted to move to South America with his wife and daughter. Unfortunately, it was a long journey, and he needed money. "What has that to do with me?" "Has Monsieur Pontmercy not read my letter?" Marius had only read the letter quickly, and could not remember the details, so he said, "Go on." "I have a secret to tell you, Monsieur Pontmercy," the stranger said. "I'll tell you the first part for nothing. I think you'll be interested." "Well?" "The man you think is your wife's guardian is a murderer and a thief. His name is Jean Valjean." "I know that." "Did you know that he spent 19 years in prison?" "I know that, too." The stranger narrowed his eyes, trying to hide his disappointment and anger at Marius's calmness. Then he gave a strange smile. "I have more information to tell you. It concerns money that belongs to your wife. It's a remarkable secret, and I'll sell the information to you for 20,000 francs. "I know this secret already," Marius said, "just as I knew the others." 10,000 francs? I repeat, you have nothing to tell me. "But I need to eat, monsieur," the visitor said, losing confidence. "I'll tell you for 20 francs. "I know it already," Marius said. "I know everything. I even know your real name." "It's Thénardier." The visitor laughed, but Marius went on. "You're also Jondrette, and you once had an inn in Montfermeil." "I deny it." You're a completely rotten man. But I'll give you this." Marius took a banknote out of his pocket and threw it in the stranger's face.
"Thank you, Monsieur Pontmercy," the man said, examining the note. 500 francs, that's real money. Oh, well, I suppose we can relax."
With those words, he removed his false nose, glasses, and neat grey wig.
"Monsieur Pontmercy is absolutely right," he said, changing his voice. "I am Thénardier."
He waited for a few seconds to see Marius's reaction. Marius, meanwhile, was grateful for finally having the chance to help Thénardier, and therefore to keep the promise he had made to his father. Thénardier's presence, however, offered him another opportunity. It gave him the chance to solve the mystery of Cosette's fortune. "Thénardier," he said, "shall I tell you the secret that you were planning to sell me? I too have sources of information, and probably know more about the subject than you do. Jean Valjean, as you say, is a murderer and a thief. He's a thief because he robbed a wealthy manufacturer and mayor of Montreuil, Monsieur Madeleine. Jean Valjean, who knew the mayor's background, reported him to the police and took advantage of his arrest to take over 500,000 francs from his Paris bank. The manager of the bank told me this himself. And he murdered the policeman Javert. I know this because I was there at the time." Thénardier looked puzzled for a moment, then said,
"Monsieur, I think you are mistaken."
"What? Are you denying what I said? Those are facts."
"They are incorrect, and I do not like to hear a man unjustly accused. Jean Valjean did not rob Monsieur Madeleine, nor did he kill Javert."
"How do you know?"
"First, he did not kill Monsieur Madeleine because he was Monsieur Madeleine. And second, he did not kill Javert because Javert killed himself. He killed himself by jumping into the river."
"What proof do you have?" Marius said, wide-eyed with disbelief.
"I have all the proof here,"
Thénardier said, producing an envelope in which there were several documents and newspaper articles.
"I've spent a long time discovering the truth about Jean Valjean."
Marius studied the documents carefully, then looked up with a smile of joy. "But he's a splendid man. The fortune was really his. And he's not a murderer or a thief at all. He's a hero and a saint."
"He's a thief and a murderer,"
Thénardier said quietly. "What do you mean?"
"I told you that I do not like to see a man accused unjustly, but I do like to see a man punished for crimes he has committed."
"And what crimes are those?" Thénardier sat down and told Marius about the time he had helped Valjean to escape from the Paris sewer.
"He was carrying the body of a man he had robbed and killed," Thénardier said. "Look, I have a piece of cloth from the dead man's coat as proof."
He produced a muddy piece of cloth and showed it to Marius, who immediately went pale and rose unsteadily to his feet. As Thénardier continued to talk, Marius opened a cupboard door and took out a coat. "That man was me!" Marius cried. "And here is the coat I was wearing!" Thénardier stared at the coat and the cloth in his hands, speechless with fear. He was even more surprised when, instead of chasing him out of the room, Marius ran towards him and pressed several 1,000-franc notes into his hand. "You're a terrible man," Marius said. "A thief and a liar. You came here to destroy a man, but you have done the opposite. If you hadn't saved my father's life at Waterloo, I'd report you to the police. I know that your wife is dead, but take the money and start a new life in America with your daughter. When you arrive there, I'll send you another 20,000 francs. Now get out. I never want to see you again." When Thénardier had left, unable to believe his good fortune, Marius ran to find Cosette and told her everything immediately. "We must go to him at once," Marius said. "He was the man who saved my life. We must waste no time." Minutes later, he and Cosette were travelling in a carriage to number 7, Rue de l'Homme Armé. Jean Valjean looked up when he heard the knock on his door, and called in a weak voice, "Come in." The door opened, and Marius and Cosette appeared. Cosette rushed to the chair where Jean Valjean was sitting. "Father!" she cried, falling into his arms.
"So, you've forgiven me,"
Valjean whispered, hugging Cosette to him and turning to Marius.
"Cosette, did you hear what he said?"
Marius cried, tears of shame and guilt rolling down his cheeks. "He asked me to forgive him. And you know what he did? He saved my life, and he brought me back to you. He came to the barricade to save me, just as he saved Javert. He carried me on his back through the sewers of Paris to bring me to you. Oh, Cosette, I feel so ashamed of the way I've treated him."
"You have no need to say all this,"
Valjean murmured.
"Why didn't you say it yourself?"
Marius demanded. "Why didn't you tell me that you were Monsieur Madeleine, and that you saved Javert's life at the barricade? Why didn't you tell me that I owed you my life?"
"Because I thought it would be better to break away. If you had known the truth, you would have felt obliged to be good to me, a worthless criminal. That would have upset everything."
"What or whom would it have upset?" Marius said. "Well, we're not going to allow you to stay here on your own. You're going to come home with us. You're Cosette's father and mine. I won't allow you to spend another day here."
"And you can't refuse this time,"
Cosette agreed, sitting on Jean Valjean's lap and kissing his forehead.
"There's a carriage waiting for you. I'm kidnapping you, by force if necessary."
Jean Valjean listened as she described the view from the room that would be his, the beauty of the garden, the singing of the birds, but he was listening more to the music of her voice than to the meaning of her words. Finally he said,
"Yes, it would be delightful. But—"
Cosette, frightened, took his 2 hands in hers.
"Your hands are so cold," she said. "Are you ill? Are you in pain?"
"No,"
said Valjean.
"I'm not in pain, but—"
"But what?"
"I'm going to die soon."
"Father, no!" Cosette cried. "You're going to live! You must live, do you understand?"
Marius and Cosette both did their best to raise Valjean's spirits, to show him how much they loved and needed him, to fill him with the strength and the desire to live again. But it was too late. Valjean smiled, his eyes shining with love and happiness, but he was beginning to lose strength.
"To die is nothing," he murmured. "But it is terrible not to live."
Then, taking Cosette's sleeve and pressing it to his lips, he said,
"Come close to me, both of you. I love you dearly. How sweet it is to die like this. And you love me too, dear Cosette. You'll feel some grief for me, but not too much. I want you to have no great sorrows. You must enjoy life, my children. I'm leaving the 2 candlesticks by the bed to Cosette. They're made of silver, but to me they're pure gold. I don't know whether the person who gave them to me is pleased as he looks down on me from above. I've done my best. You mustn't forget, my children, that despite my money, I am one of the poor."
As he spoke, Valjean's breathing became more painful, and he had difficulty moving his arms. But as the weakness of his body increased, his spirit grew in strength. The light of an unknown world was shining brightly in his eyes.
"Now, Cosette," he breathed softly, "the time has come for me to tell you your mother's name. It was Fantine. You must not forget it. Your mother loved you greatly, and she suffered greatly. She was as rich in sorrow as you are in happiness. That is how God balances things out. He watches us all from above, and knows what he is doing among his splendid stars. And now I must leave you, my children. Love one another always. There is nothing else that matters in this world except love."
Cosette and Marius fell to their knees on either side of him, holding back their tears. Jean Valjean's hands rested on their bowed heads, and did not move again. He lay back, with his head turned to the sky, the light from the 2 silver candlesticks falling on